Okay, colleagues, so today a marvelous topic. Today we're going to talk about the philosophies of the Hellenistic age. Wonderful opportunity for me to talk about two of my favorite ancient Greek philosophers, Epicurus and Sextus Empiricus. Now, you'd think that this title should go to Plato and Aristotle, but there are reasons for this particular choice on my part, which hopefully I'll be able to explain in a second. So, before we begin, a word about historical context. So, the word Hellenistic age comes from the Greek word Hellas, which means Greece. So, the Hellenistic age, if you want, is the age of Greece, the age of Greek language and Greek culture spreading over the Mediterranean in the wake of the conquests of Alexander the Great. So basically the Hellenistic age approximately begins, obviously these are historical conventions, but historians usually start the Hellenistic age with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. And Alexander had a conscious policy of spreading Greek culture and Greek language throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. And so Greek becomes the lingua franca of the Mediterranean world. And basically you can immediately see, right, so you have the conquest of Alexander. Alexander dies, and almost immediately after he dies, you have a war. You may potentially call it civil war between his generals. So it's a period of tremendous chaos, both political and intellectual chaos. So political chaos because of these wars, and intellectual chaos because different cultures come into contact with one another. And the natural result of this appears to be anxiety, confusion, and relativism. Right? So people have their gods, people have their traditions. Now, people from various places get together, have a chance to compare, and see that the myths of the gods don't match up. The visions of what is the good, the proper life, are different. So again, this local narrow-mindedness very much comes into conflict. People presumably now feel the need to justify their traditions and their worldviews to other people around. Now, mostly this probably refers to this chaos refers to the intellectual elite, people who can actually speak Greek, maybe read Greek, but there's definitely this destabilizing effect. So political chaos and intellectual chaos. And so in general, the Hellenistic age begins with the death of Alexander. You have the spirit of Greek wars, then followed by the ascension of Octavian, the Emperor Augustus, around the year 330 BCE. And then you have after the Greek wars, you have the Roman peace, Pax Romana. And basically, well, it depends on when you want to end the Hellenistic age. Some historians would end it at the year 30. If we think of the philosophies of the Hellenistic age, they continue into the Roman peace, maybe into the Common Era, first, second, maybe third century. In principle, it's possible to see the continuation of the philosophies of the Hellenistic age basically into the Middle Ages, and then the Middle Ages would begin a new period. Questions of periodization are complicated, but this is the approximate lay of the land. So the particular philosophies that we're going to be talking about, basically we have around this time frame, we have Plato's Academy, which is active. Plato's Academy actually comes to be the seat of the so-called academic skepticism. Again, this skeptical element in the philosophy of Socrates, this contention, I know that I know nothing, this appears to the later Platonic Academy to be the most important aspect of philosophy of Socrates. So you have skeptical Plato's Academy to some extent. Then we have Aristotle's Lyceum, although Aristotle falls out of favor, probably as far as we can tell, for a long period of time. And then the four schools which come to the fore, it seems over and above Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, would be the Cynics, Epicureans, Skeptics, and Stoics. And in this lecture, I specifically want to focus on Epicureans and Skeptics, and between the two, even more so on Epicureans. And reasons are different and varied. We're going to talk about Stoics more next time when we talk about the Christian tradition and the natural law tradition. But the Epicureans and Skeptics uh, in many ways, seem to be very, very much attuned. They seem to be anticipating a lot of what later is going to be Western philosophical tradition after the Renaissance. So actually, if we had more classes, or if this was a different kind of course, I would actually prefer to focus more on Epicureans and Skeptics, maybe even more than on Plato and Aristotle and on all the others. Why? Because again, Epicureans and Skeptics, I think, uniquely lay the foundation for the modern European philosophy that is going to come after the Renaissance, after the Protestant Reformation. So especially in philosophers such as Niccolo Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, very importantly, John Stuart Mill, and other names can be alluded to, right? Certain important elements of Epicureanism and Skepticism will be activated. So again, I encourage us to pay very close attention to these two schools. So Epicurus and the founder of the so-called Pyrrhonian skepticism, supposed to be Pyrrho, they both were active approximately around the year 300 BCE, which makes them approximate contemporaries of Aristotle, actually. Maybe slightly younger contemporaries of Aristotle. Pyrrho's writings don't survive, so when I'm going to talk about skepticism, mostly going to focus on Sextus Empiricus, on the works of Sextus Empiricus, and with Epicurus we have his writings surviving, so we'll talk about Epicurus proper. Now, one important thing I want to mention before we begin, right? So, the Hellenistic age is by and large an age of chaos, political and intellectual chaos, which ends with the establishment of the Roman Empire. And this is peace, but this is very tenuous peace, because it is peace under the domination of Rome. So it is, first, the Hellenistic age starts with chaos and therefore lack of freedom, but then you have peace, but still there's an important sense lack of freedom, especially lack of political freedom. And so we will see a very important private component in all of these philosophies. These four schools focus on the issues, the problems that face the private individual, and they will address individual, as a private individual. And this is why all four schools will have an important cosmopolitan character to them. Cosmopolitan character to their philosophies, and again, addressing individuals as individuals. And in many ways, this emphasis on the private individual can be summarized in the following phrase: the world is bad, let us learn to be independent from it. The world is bad, let us learn to be independent from it as individuals. Now, there is obviously an important connection between this outlook and the chaotic or the unfree character of the time period. But I want to urge you, colleagues, not to reduce these philosophical schools to the time frame in which they were born, to the particular historical circumstances. It is my strong assertion, it is my strong contention that, again, the message of these four schools, and again, especially of the Epicureans and of Skeptics, is deeply important for the Western philosophical tradition in its entirety. And I want to invite you to consider the conclusions of these schools on their own terms, as speaking not only to their time period, but as speaking very importantly to us right now in the 21st century. Another philosopher we'll get a chance to talk about, Michel Foucault, actually, in an important sense, saw in the Hellenistic schools, especially with their therapeutic and individualistic approach, saw a very important, very fruitful context for thematizing our own lives and our own relationship to ourselves in terms of, again, technologies of the self, care of the self. So Michel Foucault saw particular unique insights in the philosophies of these schools, again, which have timeless significance even for us today. And this is hopefully what I'm going to try to show in the coming segments. Okay, let's try to start somewhere. Hellenistic schools is a broad and complicated context, but one potential way in is, again, to go back to maybe one of the, or maybe the most important question of our course: what is the good? How do we define the good, right? Especially, what is the good life? What should I do with my life, right? And, well, we have seen the sophistic challenge, and the sophists basically imply, especially Callicles and Thrasymachus, imply that the word good is weaponized by culture, by society, or by certain elements of society. This concept of good, of goodness or justice, is weaponized by certain groups to keep individuals or other groups in submission, right? So see the notion of justice as simply masking the interest of the stronger or of the multitude. This was the challenge. Plato had a certain response, but you remember, Plato does not write treatises, he writes dialogues, so I would refrain from attributing strong positions to Plato. So let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle, I think, is a more immediate point of comparison. And indeed, when later in the Middle Ages we're going to see the so-called Neoplatonic, well, starting with Plotinus and then continuing on into the Middle Ages, we're going to see the Neoplatonic synthesis of Plato and Aristotle. Plato is going to be read through this Aristotelian lens, so potentially inaccurately, right? So I want to kind of separate Plato proper from the Aristotelian Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato. So let me just focus on Aristotle. So as we have seen last time, Aristotle has these strong teleological assumptions about the universe, that this world is a deeply orderly place, that there's a natural hierarchy of goodness, beauty, of existence, very importantly, of value in this cosmos. Right, and this was the underlying feature of his, broadly speaking, conservative outlook. This world is good. Nature does nothing in vain, and men are by nature political. It is in our deep interest to be members of the polis, etc., etc. And in fact, again, the intimation that nature is already as good as it can be. Now, the immediate question we can ask is, why does Aristotle think that? Can he substantiate his worldview with strong arguments? Again, remember, Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, these are not religious prophets. What is their claim to the truth? Supposedly it should be established by arguments. So let's look at what those arguments are. We're going to get to religious prophets at a later class, because what is the claim of religious prophets? To speak for the gods. That's another separate issue. But still, right? So the immediate challenge, I think, to Aristotle's teleology is a certain, broadly speaking, skeptical outlook. Again, Socrates himself, in Plato's potentially early dialogues, very often these quote-unquote early dialogues end with an aporia, an impasse. No conclusion is reached, right? And seems to be in line with Socrates' basic commitment to this notion that human intellect is limited, and he is wise who, like Socrates, understands that human wisdom is limited, and maybe the gods know truths with capital T about the world, but these are not really available to individuals. So again, it's an important element of skepticism. And we have mentioned that Aristotle, broadly speaking, sometimes is classified as an empiricist or maybe as a proto-empiricist. Well, actually, the Epicureans are also empiricists. We're going to get to Epicureans in detail in a second, but Epicureans rely on the testimony of the senses. And it's interesting because we have two arguments which are similar in form, but with radically different conclusions. Basically, what Aristotle is saying is that when he looks around, he says, this world is far too orderly to be a product of random chance. This world is far too orderly to be a result of random chance. So there must be a designer, there must be a divine intelligence behind this world. Broadly speaking, the idea of intelligent design. The Epicureans flip this argument upside down completely. They're going to say, no, this world is very obviously far too chaotic to be a result of intelligent design. And so, therefore, their solution is going to be, well, again, in this proto-Darwinian, quasi-Darwinian, proto-Darwinian style of thought, the Epicureans are going to say, imagine we have a random jumbling of particles that just collide with each other, which follow, again, sort of materialistic atomic theory. Again, in the words of Immanuel Kant, the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter in motion. Particles, let's say atoms, colliding with each other according to a mechanical necessity. So not teleology, but mechanism. And so, as a result of this, we see the world around. Empiricus, another Greek philosopher writing before Epicurus, makes the following analogy. He says, imagine that through this random jumbling of particles, different forms come into being. Any possible form comes into being. Let's say animals which have branches instead of limbs, or let's say an eye with 15 hands, or maybe a hand with 15 eyes. Well, the point Empiricus makes, and this again, this proto-Darwinian, anticipating Darwin, is going to say most of these animals are not going to be viable. They're not going to be able to survive, and probably not going to be able to reproduce. So the only ones which are left are the ones which are, so to speak, fit for this world. Again, there were important advances in the sciences, especially in geology, before this picture became more compelling. But in broad outline, the basics of Darwinian evolution were already, intelligible to the ancient Greeks. A strong claim, but at least that's the way it appears to us. And so, in many ways, I feel that what this debate rests on, is the problem of evil. Where does evil come from? Right? Can Aristotle explain where evil comes from? You see, Plato is a complicated philosopher, but you can see, especially in the Republic, there's this intimation in the Republic that there's the perfect world above the perfect world of the forms, especially the form of the good. And then there's this world down here, the world of change and decay below. And there's a certain duality. There is something like evil in this world, and Socrates says as much in the Republic. And he says that in the myths, in the noble lie, the philosophers are going to say that the good comes from the forms or from the gods, but the evil does not come from the gods. So there's a certain dichotomy, there's a certain duality of good versus evil. Right? And this world, it seems, especially in the Republic, or in other dialogues, in other Plato's dialogues, very often Socrates speaks as if this world is bad or mostly bad, and in fact, the virtue, the excellence of a private individual is realized in the private sphere against the by and large evil nature of political association. And in fact, again, another intimation. I don't want to say doctrine, I don't want to ascribe doctrines to Plato, right? Another intimation in his dialogues is that maybe life is just preparation for death. And maybe if the soul is immortal, the happiness is going to be realized beyond this world. So Plato, in this sense, is more or less immune to the problem of evil. Plato, in many dialogues, is happy to admit that this world is full of evil. Why? Because in some sense, you could say, matter is evil. Right? This is going to be the Neoplatonic interpretation of matter is pure nothingness, and in this sense, it's pure evil. And you have this, again, natural hierarchy, and we find ourselves in this unfortunate place in the cosmos. Again, for Aristotle, this, and for many philosophies that are going to follow in Aristotelian wake, that are going to have this teleological outlook, philosophies such as the Stoics and certain strands of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim philosophy especially, the problem of evil is going to be especially pertinent, especially striking, especially problematic, right? This idea of if the universe is on the whole good, or maybe if the universe is guided by providential gods or God, why is there evil in the world? And again, colleagues, I want us to avoid the temptation to jump to simple conclusions. Sometimes I see students assuming that the problem of evil must have a solution. Well, we do not know that. And in fact, Sextus Empiricus attributes the following argument to Epicurus So again, it's an argument from Epicurus which survives in Sextus Empiricus, that precisely because there's evil in the world, we can be sure that this world is not divinely guided. Either gods do not exist, or if they do exist, they do not care about us. This interesting position about gods not caring about us, you can see already in Aristotle. Divine intelligence is thought thinking itself in this stable fashion. In Aristotle, gods also presumably don't care about us, because caring about petty humans is not the kind of thing that gods do. And it would be useless, futile, and maybe even blasphemous for Aristotle if you decided to pray to gods. So it would be disrespectful to imagine that gods would occupy themselves with this world of change in the sublunar world. So in an important sense, I feel that for Aristotle, Aristotle's teleology is kind of an unintentional byproduct of the divine activity. So the world is orderly and on the whole good, not because gods intervene directly, but because, so again through this maybe astronomical, mediated by the motions of the spheres, the influence, the good influence of the gods is a byproduct of their activity on the world. But the gods don't care about this. Again, gods, pure contemplation, thought, thinking itself. But again, Aristotle has this view of the gods, but can he really substantiate it? And again, when you talk about empiricism, I feel that Aristotle's empiricism is much less empirical than, let's say, Epicurean empiricism, or later, what we're going to see down the line, the modern European empiricism of philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes or David Hume, for example, right? So in fact, this idea that this world appears to be chaotic and not at all providentially guided, this is going to be associated with later empiricist tradition. So in this sense, again, I mentioned that when you compare Plato to Aristotle, Aristotle seems to be more on the empiricist side. But when you compare Plato and Aristotle to Epicureans, both Plato and Aristotle seem to be very much on the teleological side, if you want, rationalist side. They need some other kinds of arguments, rational arguments for their, non-empirical arguments to substantiate their positions, which may or may not be good arguments. It's a complicated question. So I'm trying to lay out everything at the same time, so this may be a bit confusing, but I promise we're going to go over this once again, step by step. So I'm trying to talk about Epicureans and Skeptics at the same time, although Skeptics were not Epicureans and Epicureans were not Skeptics, but I think there's an important common cause that both make against Aristotle. So again, if we try to think through this in a deeper fashion, so the Skeptics, in many ways the core of skeptical philosophy, can be expressed in the problem of the criterion. So let's talk in more detail about skeptics. So here, when I talk about skeptics, I mean Pyrrhonian skeptics as known to us through the works of Sextus Empiricus. So again, to try to summarize their philosophy as briefly as possible, the central issue is the problem of the criterion. What is the criterion of truth? What is the criterion of knowledge? And now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a certain kind of rational reconstruction with certain elements of modern philosophy. So this is not exactly the way Sextus presents it, but I think it's fine for our purposes. But be careful with the exact words that I'm using. So again, the human mind appears to have, broadly speaking, two ways of accessing the reality. Contemporary philosophy of science talks about induction and deduction. So induction would refer to experience of the senses, sense data, and deduction would refer to pure logic. So this would be experience, and this would be pure logic, pure reason. Now, the problem is that both of these have issues. So if you talk about the problem of induction, we'll get there, and we'll talk about this much more when we get to David Hume. He's the champion of the problem of induction. But basically, the idea is that if you rely on the senses, they do give you a kind of truth, but this truth is really impossible to generalize reliably. So it is true that right now, it seems to me that there are words written on this board, right? It is true that it seems to me that there are these letters. But how do I know? Maybe I'm hallucinating. Maybe I'm mad. And, even if I think this inside of my own head, even if I see the letters, my experience is in an important sense private. You cannot double check my experience. And this is why it's always possible for humans to mislead one another. It's possible to lie, right? So basically the problem of induction is that it's difficult to generalize, or in fact, David Hume is going to say it is impossible to reliably generalize the experiential knowledge, the experiential sense data, beyond the immediate situation in which you observe this particular data. So every time I let the marker go and it falls down, right, I have a certain experience, but how do I know in the experience of the marker falling, do I see the necessity? Do I see the future of the marker falling? Next time I let it go, who knows? Maybe it's going to fly up instead of down, or just hang in the air. There's nothing in my experience guarantees that this is going to happen, right? So in an important sense, you could say induction does not justify itself. In induction, experiential knowledge is trying to establish conclusions about the future based on the past, but because we do not see the future right now, the only way this can be justified is by using a baseless assumption which itself cannot be grounded, that the future will resemble the past. Since I do not see the future right now, there's no experiential reason for me to believe that the future will resemble the past. So similar problem is the problem of deduction. So if the problem of induction is associated with David Hume, Hume talks about deduction as well, but this is, in the 21st century, this is mostly associated with the works of 20th century philosophers, Ludwig Wittgenstein and Kurt Gödel. Talk about them later on, maybe a little bit. And the problem of deduction is kind of similar, that you can use logic, it seems, to arrive at certain conclusions, but can you use logic to prove the validity of logic itself? Can you use logic in order to prove the validity of logic? Right? And if you are using logic to prove the validity of logic, doesn't mean that you are presupposing what you are intending to prove. So there's a certain circularity there. This is, again, I suppose the most important result on this side of the problem of deduction is that there's actually a logical theorem which has been proven by famous logician Kurt Gödel, which basically says that any kind of logical system which is powerful enough to encompass arithmetic, this logical system necessarily will have to contain assumptions which cannot be proven within the system. Statements which are maybe true but cannot be proven within the system. So unprovable assumptions, right? And that's a problem. We have unprovable assumptions that, broadly speaking, future will resemble the past on the induction side, and an unprovable assumption that logic works on the deduction side. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but that's the basic issue. And so the problem of the criterion is that either, when you're trying to establish the criterion for truth, you have to either run into an infinite regress, or you run into circularity. And both of these are bad. And so in an important respect, the skeptical conclusion is that true, infallible knowledge with a capital T is simply unavailable to the human beings. It's just not in the cards. Okay, so if knowledge is unavailable, what is then the solution? What are we supposed to do? Are we just supposed to, stay still and do nothing, right? Not exactly. Pyrrhonian skeptical arguments known to us through Sextus have this important concept of epoche, which means suspension of judgment. So basically, suspension of judgment or withholding of assent. So basically, we refuse to accept anything as finally true, accept anything as truth with capital T. So what we do instead, Sextus says, is we acquiesce before the appearances. There are appearances, and you see an important link here between skepticism and empiricism, the experience, right? Appearances force themselves upon us. Right? I wake up in the morning as a skeptic. Why do skeptics get out of bed in the morning, right? And or maybe you wake up in the morning and you have a feeling, an uncomfortable feeling of desire to maybe have a glass of water, right? Why would you resist this desire? Is this desire true? Is it going to lead to good outcomes? You don't know. But is this desire evil? Is it going to lead to bad outcomes? You don't know either. But the problem is that desire is present to you. So so you are not, like, there's an important kind of negative element in skepticism, right? You're not making positive assertions. You're not saying, oh, I feel the thirst, and so therefore I will go and take a glass of water. You formulate this in the negative. I feel thirst. It is uncomfortable, and I see no reason to resist this urge. And in an important sense, it's not a conscious, rational choice. My body takes over. My body just takes over. It takes me out of bed and leads me to the kitchen to take a glass of water. But as I am doing this, I'm not committing myself any step of the way. I'm not committing myself to the truth of what I see. So notice, what are the ethical and the political implications of this view, right? So the skeptics will refuse to grant that anything can be known to be good or evil by nature. Maybe there is this criterion of goodness or badness, of good and evil, but it's just not available to human beings. So what we do, again, is we do not resist the appearances. Because in some sense, it's just immediately a more comfortable thing to do, and it's hard to justify resisting the appearances, right? And so, in an important sense, again, there's a particular partial commitment to empiricism, and therefore a partial, although we have to be careful with this, partial with a question mark justification of hedonism within the skeptical tradition. Because again, the criterion of goodness or badness is unavailable to me. I do not know what is good or evil in and of itself. So I'm going to go along. I'm going to not resist the feelings of pleasure and pain which simply appear to me directly. And again, notice that pleasure and pain, I do not need a separate argument to establish that pleasure is good or that pain is evil. I feel pleasure as something nice, automatically and directly. It is the part of feeling of pleasure that you like it. And it is part of the feeling of pain or discomfort that you do not like it. And you do not need a separate argument to establish this. So this is, again, with a question mark, let's be careful with this, but this seems to be a certain partial endorsement of hedonism on the one hand, but also politically a very important endorsement of conservatism on the part of the skeptics. And we have, if you look at some of the sophistic writings, you can also see, for example, in Gorgias, a similar commitment to conservatism. Basically, since we do not know what is the ultimate source of goodness, including of political goodness, then it's probably a good idea to just not make trouble. Right? It's like you find yourself in a working social arrangement, so unless something is going terribly wrong, just go with the flow. When in Rome, do as the Romans. Because, again, this criterion that would help you establish that the Romans are objectively evil is just not available to you. Now, when we get to Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes is going to import many of the skeptical elements into his philosophy. And I think Hobbes would say that if something horrible is happening to you, if your life is being actively threatened, then again, the appearance of danger forces itself upon you, and so you will take political action to protect yourself. But again, in many ways, you will take this action passively. You will simply not resist the natural urge that you find yourself with to protect yourself. See? Kind of a very interesting formulation. Again, in many ways, negative formulation. I want you to see that it's very different from what Aristotle is talking about. And we're definitely going to talk about this in more detail, but there's this very famous problem in philosophy of ethics, or even of meta-ethics, axiology, the so-called is-ought problem. How can we derive normative conclusions from positive premises? If the world is a certain way, why does this lead to any kind of moral conclusion? And we're going to talk about this in more detail, but I want you to see that I feel that the skeptics are mostly immune to this problem. The skeptics are not asserting that following pleasure is the good. Skeptics are going to say, we do not know what is good or evil. We simply acquiesce. We simply do not resist the feelings, the passions that impose themselves upon us. But about the nature of the good itself, we suspend judgment. We do not say anything. Okay, colleagues, so let me warn you. So in my presentation of Epicureans, I'm mostly engaging in something like rational reconstruction. And also, I suppose my most important task is to lay the groundwork for moral and political philosophies of modernity that we're going to talk about later down the line. So in certain respects, you should take my descriptions with a grain of salt. I'm trying less to be literal, and again, to a larger extent, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show what ideas are going to be important, what ideas are going to have traction down the line, like the takeaway points, which may or may not coincide with the letter of the Epicurean teaching. Now, again, I remind you that most of the ancient literature is lost, and the writings of Epicurus are mostly lost, and the writings of Pyrrho probably never wrote anything. So, both reconstructing Epicurean philosophy and Pyrrhonian skeptical philosophy, these are complicated enterprises. I should also say that, by and large, later philosophical tradition, when we talk about the Western context, so Christian, Jewish, and Muslim philosophers, by and large, did not look at Epicureans and skeptics favorably. These were supposed to be atheists, materialists, skeptics, right? So they were, the later religious philosophers were less interested in preserving their ideas, were more interested in attacking their ideas. So this is another level of complexity that we need to keep in mind. However, again, I draw your attention to the fact that these philosophies will become reactivated, will become extremely important after in the course of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, and will later be instrumental in establishing the new European philosophy. Okay, in this segment, I want to try to lay out the basic tenets of Epicurean philosophy as clearly as possible. So, Epicureans were not skeptics, skeptics were not Epicureans. But I'm going to try to some extent to combine the two. So I feel that Greek philosophers in general, like Socrates or maybe Heracles writing before Socrates and others, Empiricus, that in general Greek philosophy had, talk about the sophists, obviously, had an important skeptical element in it, right? So philosophers understood that they were not prophets from gods. They had to advance arguments, and arguments were tentative, dialogical, open-ended. So I feel, even though Epicureans later begin to venerate Epicurus with religious fervor and even call him a god, I would urge us to be slightly more cautious. I think that Epicurus, in my own rational reconstruction, understood that his arguments were tentative, so I would say that underlying his whole philosophy, although this is very much my own interpretation, so please take it with a grain of salt, there is an underlying grain of skepticism. Again, Epicurus is not trying, as far as I can tell us truth from the gods, but only a likely account based on what we see around. So skepticism leads us, in some sense, naturally to empiricism, right? Because you can have an interesting rational argument. For Plato and Aristotle, especially for Aristotle, it seems that, we mentioned this briefly, that mind is ontologically prior to matter. That, Aristotle believes that mind can, form matter, or maybe even originate matter, but matter cannot originate mind. So mind is prior and superior to matter. But, why? Why do we think that? Is there a knockdown argument? Is it a logical reason to believe that in the same fashion the triangle must have three sides? It's a complicated question. So it's always nice to do a reality check and to look at empirical evidence, right? And in Aristotle's day, there was no empirical evidence, but today we know about computers, for example, and computers definitely possess some form of intelligence, depending on how you define intelligence. Are computers conscious? Well, it's a complicated question, right? But what I'm saying is that, maybe it's ultimately an empirical question. Does mind give rise to matter, or does matter give rise to mind? So empiricism, I think, is a natural way to do a bit of a reality check. And so if you start with skeptical premises, empirical arguments seem to have certain important traction. Although again, philosophers will disagree, but starting roughly from the Renaissance, from modernity, empiricism will be in ascendance. And I want to say very much empiricism seems to be in ascendance in philosophy today. And again, Epicureans were empiricists. Their arguments are mostly empirical in nature. So, methodologically, start with a grain of skepticism. Methodologically, then proceed with empiricism. Again, and this is a much deeper commitment to empiricism than we see in Aristotle. Not jumping to conclusions, but just going with the appearances, the way things appear to us. And so, what we get then is a certain account of materialism. Now, this was an age-old debate. It was not settled in the ancient times, but the basic idea was that the world is made up of small, indivisible, substantial particles, which the Greek word atom, uncuttable, means uncuttable, right? And the preliminary empiricist argument for materialism, specifically for atomic materialism, is that there's change in the world, but there's also stability. Things don't seem to appear just out of nothing, empirically speaking, and don't seem to disappear into nothingness either. So if you take wood, mostly any kind of piece of wood will burn, and what you will be left is ash and smoke, right? And you take this tree, you take that tree, and the result appears to be similar, right? So there's a natural presupposition that, there's a micro structure, micro elements of which the wood is made, and so these micro elements themselves are substantial, changeless, but they transform, right? They simply take a different shape, a different configuration. In one configuration, the same atoms look like a piece of wood. In a different configuration, they look like smoke and ash. But this explains both continuity and change at the same time. So some things change, but there's an underlying stability behind this. Again, this is a preliminary argument for materialism, specifically atomistic materialism. Now, again, already mentioned that, very importantly, materialism was supposed to be deployed against Aristotle's teleology. Again, according to the Epicureans, this world, and mentioned the problem of evil, right? This world seems to be far too chaotic to be a result of providence. So, Epicureans would explain it as a result of random chance. The word chance is complicated, but let's say random interactions between these particles. Random in the sense of not purposeful, non-purposeful interactions between the atoms. And in a similar fashion, we can talk about two other aspects of this view. So one is we can talk about the soul, and for the Epicureans, on their assumptions, the soul is just fine kind of matter or fine kind of material structure which propagates throughout the body. So according to the Epicureans, the soul is material. And again, you can ask for empirical arguments in favor of this position, and there are empirical arguments readily available. Basically, you can try this at home. If you take some kind of a psychoactive substance, let's say alcohol or maybe chocolate, right? And you take a piece of chocolate, or unless this offends your religious sentiments, maybe you take a bit of alcohol, right? And this material interaction, this material transaction, influences your soul, influences not only your mood, but even maybe your personality, right? So it seems that a natural conclusion would be that if your soul can be influenced by matter, then the soul itself is material. And likewise, I have a soul, presumably, according to the Epicureans, let's say, and my soul decides to raise my arm. I have a feeling, I have a thought, I should raise my arm, and the arm goes up. So the causation goes both ways. So the natural thing to assume is that the soul just is the material, organization. A certain kind of fine organization of matter, akin to our contemporary understanding of the nervous system. This will have crucial implications. Partly is that, when the body dies, the soul is destroyed with the body. And so Epicureans, a very important point that they're going to make is that death is not a good thing, but also not a bad thing, because death is just nothingness, right? And if you imagine that all of our senses are dependent on the machinery, on the physical machinery of our body, so like I am conscious right now because I see things, I feel the air around me, I hear the sound of my voice. But if you take away all of the senses, all of my senses, there seems to be nothing left for me to be conscious of. So therefore, according to the Epicureans, death cannot be a bad thing. It is annihilation. It's not good, but it's also not bad. It's not to be feared. In a similar vein, this commitment to materialism leads to a certain kind of attitude, peculiar attitude toward the gods. So with a question mark, agnosticism or atheism, because I think the official position of the Epicureans is that gods exist. It's just that gods, by definition, within the ancient Greek worldview, are happy and eternally blessed. And because gods are happy and blessed, they do not care about the world. Maybe they are made of these stable configurations of atoms in this quasi-Aristotelian fashion. The gods simply contemplate their own existence. They simply exist in this state of perpetual calmness and tranquility. And maybe gods do really exist. We should not be afraid of them. They do not care about us. We also should not pray to them. Again, like for Aristotelians, for Epicureans, it would be mad and even maybe a little bit disrespectful to pray to the gods. Again, especially this notion that, you have these petty tribes, petty human tribes fighting with each other. One tribe believes that God of the universe, the creator of heaven and earth, is on their side. This seems to be a bit megalomaniacal, let's put it that way, right? And so you're not supposed to fear the gods, you're not supposed to pray to the gods, but definitely you should try to emulate the gods, right? They exist in this perpetually calm state of happiness, and we should also be try to be calm and happy. There's another possibility within the Epicurean writings that maybe gods exist only as fantasies in human mind. So they are real, but they exist only as fantasies. This puts this view very close to definition of atheism. But again, with a question mark, in fact, in principle, later down the line, especially after the rediscovery of Epicurean writings in the Renaissance, you even had Christian Epicureans, which is a possibility, which we don't have to talk about right now. So finally, let's get to this very important point. And in many ways, this is by far the most important element, politically and ethically, of the Epicurean doctrine. This is the notion of hedonism. And again, I want to draw a broad analogy between skeptics and Epicureans. You see, again, this ancient, well, I don't want to say ancient, this is mostly a modern problem of which was formulated, I think, first, well, in its canonical formulation, appears in David Hume. It's called the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine. So if state of affairs is a certain way, does it mean that it ought to be some other way? Can you derive an ought from an is? Can you derive a normative statement from a positive statement? So again, we'll spend much more time talking about this later down the line. But again, the idea is that if you simply describe the state of affairs in a certain way, let's say, I tell you, please don't hurt me. And you ask me why. And I say, because I feel pain, right? Without an additional assumption that pain is bad, there's no reason for you not to hurt me, right? It seems that values can only be derived from other values. Values in and of themselves don't exist, right? And, well, at least the skeptical argument would say we do not have any access to what values are with a capital V in and of themselves. So in the absence of the conclusive argument that would show to us what is good, we fall back. And instead of, capital V values, so we don't have values with capital V values. We don't have that. We don't have access to that. So instead, we have small v values. So in many ways, I want to say this is revaluation of values. It's Nietzsche before Nietzsche, right? God is dead. Well, maybe not dead, but at least gods don't care about us. So it's up to us to try to make this life palatable. We're not trying to achieve universal goodness, but we are trying to make life more palatable. And so this leads to a certain kind of hedonistic conclusion. The Greek word hedonism comes from hedone, which means pleasure. Right? And so the idea is that we do not know what is good in and of itself. So again, in a similar fashion to the skeptics, we acquiesce before the appearances. Epicurus says, naturally, children and animals and all human beings naturally just want to gain pleasure and to avoid pain, naturally, as a matter of fact, as a matter of empirical observation. And so in the absence of arguments to the contrary, that's what they're going to do. Again, I wake up in the morning, I want to take a glass of water, and since there's no deep reason for me not to do that, I just go and do that. Not because it is good with a capital G, but because it's painful for me to resist my desire. And in the absence of a conclusive argument to the contrary, that's what I do. I go and take a glass of water. Notice, it's very important, in Epicureans, this is an immanent criterion of goodness. Immanent in the sense that it is present to my mind. The criterion of what is good or evil is directly present to me empirically. I don't have to, again, compare this to a transcendent criterion. Transcendent criterion, again, in this sense, immanent is what is present to my consciousness. Transcendent is what goes beyond experience in this particular phrase. So let's say somebody tells me, do this because the gods want you to do this. Well, again, my desires are immediately present to me. The desires or commands of the gods are not immediately present to me. Potentially mediated by prophets, or even if I see a dream about gods talking to me and telling me something to do, should I do that? Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe I'm hallucinating. You see, again, this important difference. Again, the criterion of goodness for Epicureans and skeptics has to be present within me. Has to be directly present to my mind. An important, again, element of self-reliance, an important element of autonomy. Let's think about this. Distinction between immanent and transcendent criterion with respect to the sophists. What would sophists say? Thrasymachus or Callicles? Gods tell you, don't drink water in the morning, don't drink water before noon. Callicles and Thrasymachus are going to say, is it true? Do the gods really tell me? Or is it that, again, Critias would say it's not gods who make men, but it's men who make gods, who invent gods for political reasons? Is it the case that gods don't want me to drink water before noon? Or is it the case that, let's say, the priests or the prophets are mistaken or lying to me for their own political reasons and trying to persuade me of something? You see? The transcendent criterion is not present to me, cannot be verified. So therefore, again, against Nietzsche before Nietzsche, I have to fall back on the immanent criterion. I do what feels good because that's the only verifiable criterion which is present to me right now. Again, why do I drink water? Because I'm thirsty. Why do I not put my hand on a hot stove? Because that's painful. Again, empirically verifiable, present to me right here, right now. So, if we were to try to summarize the Epicurean teaching, well, Epicureans themselves had a summary, which they refer to as Tetrapharmakos, which means the fourfold cure of, consisting of 4 parts. Some of you may hear an echo of the Buddhist Four Noble Truths. No relation, actually, between these two uses of the number 4. However, I do want to say that I feel that there's a deep affinity between philosophies of skepticism and Epicureanism on the one hand in ancient Greece and philosophy of Buddhism in ancient India. Specifically, again, I would say that there are, broadly speaking, important skeptical and also maybe quasi-Epicurean insights available in Buddhism. So much so that actually, according to one tradition, Pyrrho, the founder of Pyrrhonian skepticism, she actually traveled to India with armies of Alexander the Great, and so potentially might have been exposed to Buddhist ideas, although we shouldn't take this too seriously. Anyway, Tetrapharmakos, the fourfold cure, summarized in these 4 short sentences. Gods are not to be feared. Death is nothing to us. Happiness is easy to obtain. And hardship is easy to endure. Now, let's try to go through these steps, keeping in mind the basic ideas of the Epicurean doctrine. So, gods are not to be feared because maybe they don't exist, or even if they do, according to Epicureans, they do not really care about us. And it's an important point that we're going to keep coming back to over and over and over again. You see, it's a very important issue. In most of the political philosophers we're going to talk throughout this course, even those philosophers who do believe in God or gods, very few will actually leave it up to the god or gods to solve political problems, right? Very patently, very obviously, very evidently, empirically speaking, gods do not oversee the rules of justice right here, right now. So many people get away with lying, stealing, countries get away with plunder, rape, murder, invasions, and gods do not seem to intervene, at least not in any straightforward fashion. And again, the Epicurean idea is that, again, if you think of the gods, and if you imagine that gods, or even imagine a singular god, is the highest expression of perfection, this perfection would have to entail, for Epicureans, by definition of perfection, a certain kind of stability. Gods, or God, would be less perfect if they cared about what happens in this world of change and decay. So, in an important sense, again, for Epicureans, the proper vision of the gods, if they exist, or God, they exist in a state of perpetual tranquility and bliss, without any care for what goes down below. So gods should not be feared. And again, this is immediately important, right? So these 4 points, they're all deeply practical. This is basically the Epicurean guide on how to be happy, how to achieve happiness in this life. Again, I remind you that for Greeks in general, philosophy was supposed to be to the soul what medicine is to the body. And again, Epicureanism in this sense is a deeply practical enterprise. The first and foremost, what we're trying to do is we're trying to help people be happy. And unnecessary, ungrounded fear of the gods, especially ungrounded fear of the horrors of the afterlife, simply makes our life unpleasant right here, right now, and unnecessarily unpleasant, right? And again, if we were to try to maybe combine the Epicurean and the skeptical perspective, the Epicureans believe that they have a positive argument to assert that gods don't care about us. But even if you don't buy that, again, if we go back to the Epicureans, if we go back to the skeptics, what the skeptics would probably say is that, look, gods, whether gods exist or not, or what is the shape of the gods, is far beyond our own mere human intellect. And again, in this Hellenistic age, cultures talk to one another. Different cultures have different gods, and some people just don't believe in gods at all. And how do we know? How do we decide between these various versions? So maybe, there's an Epicurean argument that gods are not evil, gods will not hurt us, and gods don't care about us. But even if you don't believe that, I think the skeptical argument would be is that we should suspend judgment about the gods. And suspension of judgment means not believing this way or that way. Gods may be good, gods may be evil, afterlife may be good, afterlife may be evil. Let's just not worry about that, because we cannot know one way or another. And we cannot do anything one way or another. I'm tempted to digress and talk about the famous thought experiment, which maybe we'll get to, the so-called Pascal's wager, invented by Blaise Pascal. And Pascal basically has this notion that, in a similar vein, Pascal is going to say, well, we don't know whether God exists or not, but there are clearly benefits to believing in God without much cost. So on the off chance that God exists, we should believe in him. I mean, Pascal is talking about a Christian God. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but you can see the point. The skeptics would disagree, because the skeptics would say, well, it's not like there's a binary opposition. You either believe or not believe in God. Use your imagination, Pascal. There are so many different versions of divinity and so many different ways to worship divinity. There are so many different potential laws that gods can command, and different gods and different religions have different moral codes. How do you choose, right? And again, Pascal thinks that this leads to some kind of pro-Christian conclusion, but I think Sextus is going to say Pascal lacks imagination, because the only possible conclusion that you can draw from this kind of argument is that you should suspend judgment and act as if, you cannot know whether gods exist, or maybe just assume methodologically that they don't exist. Although, again, skeptics will maintain that it is impossible to prove one way or another. Certainty is not in the cards for us. So continuing on with the second point, death is nothing to us. So while we are alive, death is not present. But when we die, we are no longer present. So therefore, since we do not exist when we die, nothing bad can happen to us, right? And again, the Epicureans have a certain materialist, empiricist argument that the soul dies with the death of the body. And again, I want to do the same thing I did for the first point. Let's fall back on the skeptical position. I think what the skeptics are going to say, skeptics are not Epicureans, right? Skeptics are going to say, Epicurus, you do not know with 100% certainty what's going to happen to you after you die. Again, Socrates in the Apology entertains different possibilities. He says maybe death is nothingness, or maybe there are visions of the afterlife. But in a similar fashion to when we talked about the gods, again, empirically speaking, it is impossible for us to know, or at least it is impossible for us to know with certainty what's going to happen to us after we die. Let's say if I have a dream, and in this dream I have a very vivid vision of the afterlife. How do I know that this dream is true and I'm not just being mad or hallucinating, right? So since we cannot know about what's going to happen to us after we die, we should, in a skeptical fashion, again, suspend judgment about the gods, also suspend judgment what's going to happen to us after death, right? And neither good nor bad, because we cannot know. It's not available to us. And I think the natural assumption is, again, living, bracketing out the truth about the gods, according to the skeptics, and bracketing out the truth about death. Or, again, in the stronger formulation by the Epicureans, living as if the gods don't care about us, and living as if death is not a bad thing. And there's another argument which some students have told me that they found very congenial. This argument comes from a great Epicurean poet, Lucretius. And Lucretius says the following: if we think about the time before we were born, well, first of all, nobody really remembers what happened before we were born, but certainly most people do not have any kind of deep anxiety or fear about that time. Mm-hmm. And so symmetrically, this is sometimes known as the symmetry argument. You should not worry about what's going to happen to you after you die. So if you don't think that it was somehow tragic and brutal that there was a time before you were born, you should also not be anxious about the time that's going to elapse after you die. Kind of interesting argument. Have you thought about that? Something to think about. Now, regarding the later 2 points, happiness is easy to obtain and hardship is easy to endure. These are supposed to be established through the Epicurean practice. So I'm going to talk about this in more detail in the next segment. But again, the basic idea is that what is available, what is evidently, apparently available to the human beings is a certain kind of practice, certain kinds of spiritual exercises of the soul. And these exercises allow a person to train their body and mind in such a fashion that basically any kind of hardship or pain that comes your way, you can, again, train your body to just bracket that out, to just, endure that. And likewise, the flip side of this is to take the simple pleasures in life and to focus on them, and this would allow a person, even in this troubled age, the Hellenistic age, the age of wars and chaos, even in this age, would allow an individual to be happy, acquire pleasure of a certain kind, here and now, without much risk and without much investment. And again, the basic knowledge, the basic idea here is we're talking about a certain kind of self-mastery, training, psychological exercises. And especially this third point can be summarized with a phrase I keep coming back to. Again, this notion, he is not rich who has much, but he is rich who needs little. This is basically my own paraphrase of Epicurus' precept that if you wish to make a man wealthy, do not give him money, but rather diminish his desires, decrease his desires. And again, in an empirical fashion, the Epicureans would say that if you try to do it, it is evidently possible. The same way how it's possible to engage in physical exercises and retrain your body, it's also possible, evidently, empirically, to engage in mental exercises and retrain your soul to be happy with little. And this is what we're going to talk about in greater detail in the next segment. So, we have already established that for the Epicureans, we have this, and for the Skeptics to some extent as well, we have this, so to speak, negative argument that in the absence of any kind of transcendent criterion of goodness, we should rely on our own internal feeling, right? And in an important respect, I want to know, right, that basically all of ancient Greek philosophy assumes that happiness and virtue or arete or excellence are united. That an excellent individual, a virtuous individual, feels happy in an important sense, right? And this is going to stand very much in contrast to the divine command theory that we're going to talk about in later classes. The Greeks, by and large, do not envision this possibility that maybe in this life you should suffer and you should feel bad because somehow the gods command you to do so, right? So Stoics have a complicated position. We'll talk about them later down the line. But let's just focus again on this issue that for Plato, for Aristotle, now for the Epicureans, you can call their position Eudaimonist in the sense that happiness and virtue, or happiness and excellence, are united together. So these are the similarities. Let's talk about the differences. So the most important difference, and again, we are still talking about immanent criterion. If I am doing things the right way, if I'm living the right kind of life, it should feel good, empirically speaking, right? The characteristic emotion that the Hellenistic schools are going to emphasize is, the Greek word is ataraxia, which means freedom from disturbance, literally, or freedom from perturbation. Or you could say serenity or tranquility. Serenity or tranquility. That, again, absence of desire is as good as satisfaction of desire. Interesting, potentially controversial point, right? Again, there's this notion that, you wake up in the morning, it's just a nice morning. You don't have any particular desires. Just feel okay. And it's a good state. It's a good state to be in. It's certainly a better state than having desires and trying, to satisfy them, or feeling the urge to satisfy your desires. Desires, unsatisfied desires, are painful. They cause us suffering, again, according to Epicureans. So let's talk about some Greek words and let's try to establish differences. So some sophists, especially Callicles and to some extent maybe Thrasymachus, also talk about this notion of pleonexia. And I want to especially draw this contrast between ataraxia and pleonexia. Ataraxia, again, means tranquility, serenity. Pleonexia means perpetual and restless desire to have more and more than your fair share, to have as many desires as possible and to try to satisfy them as much as possible, right? It's kind of an interesting counterposition. And again, ataraxia is an explicit goal of the Stoic, Epicurean, actually also skeptical and cynical philosophy, Cynic philosophy, reaching happiness through tranquility. But first, in the history of Greek philosophy, this appears in very sharp form in Plato's dialogue Gorgias, where Socrates argues against Callicles. And Callicles says exactly, he says that if you just want to be tranquil in life, if you just want to not have desires and be calm, Callicles says you might as well be dead. If tranquility is the goal in life, then stones and corpses are the happiest beings in the universe, right? This argument, I think, has some force. It's an interesting argument. But Socrates will have none of that. Socrates responds by saying that, the flip side, what Callicles is trying to do, having as many desires, as extravagant desires as possible, and to try to satisfy them as much as possible. Socrates responds to that by saying, this seems futile. It seems, this kind of life of unbridled passion is like carrying water in a leaky jar or carrying water in a sieve. Whatever you pour in, it flows out the bottom. There seems to be a certain element of futility in that kind of life. But actually, much more importantly, Socrates gives a very dramatic and a very, unseemly and shocking example. And I have to apologize for talking about this distressing example. But specifically, what Socrates is answering to Callicles, he asks this very important question: is it you who controls your desire, or is it your desire that controls you? The specific example that Socrates gives is, imagine a young person who is overcome by sexual lust. And because the young person is overcome by sexual lust, they allow another individual, an older individual, to take advantage of them. So being ruled by your desires, being addicted to your desires, being addicted to certain kinds of pleasure, can endanger you in some sense, can leave you open to the assault or abuse by other individuals. It leaves you, if you want, politically vulnerable, right? So this word autonomy, right? So Socrates would ask of Callicles this question of autonomy. Who controls your desires? Is it you who controls your desires, or is it that your desires control you? That simply allowing the person to gratify whichever desire they may have could lead to the situation in which the person is enslaved to their passions, slavery to passion, and therefore, because you are slave to passion, now you are also slave to other human beings. Let's say, you're slave to alcohol, and that is why you are a slave to the alcohol producing company, or you're a slave to nicotine, and therefore you are a slave to the tobacco company. And in this sense, helping the addict to overcome their desire would free the addict also from the potential encroachment by other people, by other institutions or corporations or what have you. Again, this notion of slavery to passion is an important notion that we'll keep in mind. Slavery to passion. Now, this is the basic presupposition. Let's talk about this in slightly more technical terms, the way Epicureans dress this up. So Epicureans are hedonists, but they are rational hedonists. We're trying to maximize our happiness, which we achieve through pleasure. Very importantly, this includes the future. And you could ask, well, is it rational to care about the future? And I think the Epicureans would answer, well, if you knew right now that something horrible is going to happen to you tomorrow, let's say if you knew right now that you're going to have a dangerous medical operation tomorrow, this would distress you right now. So there is an important rational reason for you to care about not only your well-being this instant, not only pleasure this instant, but also try to maximize pleasure, rationally maximize pleasure over the long run. And the Epicureans are going to say there are different kinds of desires. So there are vain desires and natural desires. So, and of the natural desires, you have the necessary desires and the unnecessary desires. And basically, the Epicureans want us to focus on the natural and necessary desires. So, let's try to give some examples. So, natural necessary desires would be things which are necessary for happiness and for life in general. So, air, water, food, some basic physical comfort in the sense of not freezing to death, for example. These are necessary desires, without which it is impossible, or at least very hard, to be happy. Then there are natural but unnecessary desires. And unnecessary desires could be, so let's write here maybe the desire for air, or water, or food. But let's say the desire for luxurious food. Or maybe the desire for sex. You can think of other desires. These desires are natural in the sense that they naturally exist in the human psyche, in the human psychology, but Epicurus maintains they are not necessary for life. And in fact, very often Epicurus is going to say it is easier for us to train our mind to not care about these desires. It is going to be easier than trying to gratify them. So the best strategy to become happy is to train yourself to be independent of these unnecessary desires rather than gratifying them. Now, of course, if gratifying these desires are costless, if somebody's just offering you a tasty meal and there's no real cost to you, and you're also fairly certain that this is not going to distress you in the future, this reminiscence of a tasty meal is not going to make you unhappy in the sense that you sort of miss the good times when you had these wonderful meals, right? So if it's costless, go for them, right? So Epicurus is committed to hedonism. So free pleasure should always be, is always good. However, very often the gratification of these desires comes with strings attached. But in addition to all of these, there are also vain desires. And these desires, first and foremost, have to do with glory seeking for Epicurus. Desire to have ourselves praised, or desire for statues to be erected in our honor. And Epicurus, for his own reasons, believes that these desires are vain. They are not even natural. And whereas these desires, we all have them, and it's fine to gratify them if they're not too costly. These desires, Epicurus wants to say we should avoid them because these desires lead to conflict. In an important sense, I feel that especially when we talk about this glory, vain desires for glory, vain glory, it's a desire which is deeply connected to the notion of pleonexia. If we want to be glorified, notice, so only one person can be most glorious. Only one person can be the king of the world. So this vain desire for glory necessarily puts us into conflict with other individuals. And so Epicurus would say, in some sense, these desires are never costless, and as a matter of fact, they are never really worth it. So this is the basic story. Let's fill in a couple more details. So also, Epicurus is going to say that pleasure comes in two sorts. There's dynamic pleasure and static pleasure. Another term that's used is kinetic pleasure and katastematic pleasure. So kinetic or dynamic pleasure is a pleasure which is intrinsically linked to pain. So before you can enjoy food, you need to feel the pain of hunger. Before you can enjoy sex, you need to feel the pain or the discomfort of unsatisfied sexual desire. So there's an intrinsic link. Likewise, if you eat food or drink alcohol, there's a characteristic possibility of getting like too much of a good thing, like getting hungover, eating too much and getting a stomachache, drinking too much and getting a headache in the morning. So there are particular kinds of pleasures, particular kinds of desires which are intrinsically linked with pain. And then there are other kinds of desires, so the static desires, which are pure, unmixed. So the most important pleasure of this sort is going to be ataraxia, tranquility. Again, Epicurus is going to say the sage, the wise person, trains their mind. You wake up in the morning, you have trained yourself to be free from these unnecessary and vain desires, and you just feel good. You naturally enjoy your constitution, your physical constitution, the way you find yourself. Again, you wake up in the morning and you're just happy to be alive, and you don't need anything for that. It's completely free. But in addition to this, ataraxia, which again is this, you should feel. If some of you may be reminded of the Sanskrit words of moksha and nirvana, especially in the Buddhist context, but also in other Indian contexts, right? So nirvana is freedom from desire, freedom from craving, extinguishing of desire. And I do think that there's a deep analogy between these two thoughts. So this would be kind of the paradigmatic notion of tranquility that we're trying to achieve. Let me note parenthetically that actually the skeptics also thought that bracketing out the worries about the future, bracketing out thoughts about what is right and what is wrong, in general, like suspending judgment as much as possible, also helps us achieve ataraxia. So it's kind of interesting that the skeptics also saw their practice, especially this epoche, suspension of judgment, as conducive to ataraxia. And in fact, they saw this calmness, tranquility, serenity as a result of this skeptical practice. And again, if you take skepticism and Epicureanism and put them together, you get something I feel very close to Buddhism. But in addition to ataraxia, Epicurus is going to say that in general, learning, wisdom, philosophy gives us pleasure. And this is what I talked about, what I have on the board as well, right? So you have Aristotelian Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia in general just means happiness in ancient Greek. But in this context, when I write about flourishing, I mean Aristotelian kind of flourishing, developing our rich and varied abilities. You know, having property, having children, having family, participating in politics. In general, Epicurus, per se, would not be against that. He would probably classify this mostly as unnecessary desire, just providing variety, but you know, if it's costless, go for it, right? So Aristotelian Eudaimonia, there's a certain limited defense of Aristotelian Eudaimonia, hedonistic defense of Aristotelian Eudaimonia within Epicureanism. But also, again, this characteristic Platonic happiness through theoria, through contemplation, or again, what Aristotle talks about as the highest happiness available to a human being, through this intellectual virtue, contemplation, philosophy, that's also fine. So we can talk about ataraxia if you want. I could write philosophy or Sophia or wisdom. Let's write philosophy. But also, very interestingly, very importantly, for Epicurus, also the pleasure of friendship. And this gives us a certain, again, this notion of conflict and consensus. Epicurus and Epicureans in general thought that trying to achieve happiness together with other human beings in this friendly pursuit is uniquely conducive to our happiness. And also, very importantly, again, Epicurus would say that, you know, proper kind of friendship is a static kind of pleasure, static pleasure, in the sense that usually people, under normal circumstances, don't crave the company of their friends in this, you know, addictive kind of manner. We tend not to be addicted to our friends. And in the same fashion, it seems hard to get like hungover from spending too much time with your friends. So again, it's a characteristic kind of ataraxic kind of pleasure. Although again, being calm just with yourself, even without philosophy, even without friends, is the ultimate surefire way to become happy for the Epicureans. So let me illustrate this peculiar vision of happiness through calmness or tranquility, again, the Greek word ataraxia, with probably the most famous example of Diogenes the Cynic. And unfortunately, this is the only soundbite about cynics which we have time to go into. So this is the only discussion of cynicism we're going to get in our course. Diogenes, again, supposedly an younger contemporary of Socrates, unlike Plato and Aristotle, Diogenes seems to have emulated, very importantly, the lifestyle of Socrates. So Plato and Aristotle continue to philosophize, maybe taking some ideas from Socrates, but Diogenes, right, pursues the lifestyle, this rugged lifestyle of Socrates. So Diogenes, again, like Socrates, was a very shocking figure. Diogenes lived in the street. According to tradition, he lived in a barrel or maybe an empty wine jar. So basically, he lived like a homeless person, just randomly in the street. And the philosophical, theoretical justification of his ideas appears to come from the following set of terms. Of course, Diogenes never wrote anything, and in fact, proper cynics never wrote anything, so it's always a problem trying to reconstruct their philosophy. But again, the point is that the goal of his philosophy was also, again, happiness through a certain kind of excellence, but this was an ascetic kind of excellence. Ascesis in Greek means practice or exercise. So again, these are certain kind of mental or spiritual exercises that are supposed to make us immune to vicissitudes of life. So this is, again, through this focus on ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, tranquility, through this, what we gain is we gain autonomy, supreme autonomy, and complete independence from the world around us. And there was, again, also, probably not in a very developed form, but some account of nature and of natural desires, and of trying to be happy by gratifying simple natural desires. Again, Diogenes lives in the street, he begs for food, whatever food comes his way, he just eats it, he enjoys just, the sky, the fresh air. And in fact, cynicism, the cynical school, probably comes from the Greek word kunos, which means dog. So it's a certain kind of happiness of a dog. Again, think about a contrast between this ideal versus Aristotle's notion of rose in full bloom, how we need to develop our rich and varied abilities. For Diogenes or for Epicurus, no, again, he is not rich who has much, but he is rich who needs little. And the fewer our desires, the better. The easier it is for us to satisfy them. Now, there's a very famous story about Diogenes meeting Alexander the Great. And I think it's a very illustrative story. So presumably in a particular place, maybe in Corinth, Alexander hears about Diogenes and wants to see this curious man. And so this story is told by Plutarch, so we should take it with a grain of salt. There were no cameras back then, but presumably it's a true story. So Alexander comes and, with his whole retinue, and he greets Diogenes and he says, "Greetings, I am Alexander, the king of the known world." Presumably Diogenes responds, "Yeah, and I am Diogenes, the dog." Again, talking back to authority. And then Alexander, being amused by this strange man, says, "Diogenes, ask any boon you like. Ask me anything you want. Just for fun, I'll give it to you." And Diogenes says, yeah, you can do something for me. And this is a family-friendly lecture, so I cannot exactly tell you what I think Diogenes says, but basically, you can fill in the blank, but Diogenes basically says, "Take a hike. Stand out of my light." So this homeless dog says to the king of the world, "Yeah, you can do something for me. Stand out of my light. You're blocking the sun." The implication is this deep self-sufficiency, deep independence. Alexander can do nothing good to Diogenes. He's already as happy as he can be. Also, Alexander cannot do anything evil to Diogenes. He's completely unperturbed, undisturbed. And according to Plutarch, Alexander responds by saying, by the gods, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes. So you see again this show of force on the part of Diogenes, right? So Alexander obviously prefers to be himself, Alexander, the king of the known world. But if he were not Alexander, the second best would be to be Diogenes. It's a very interesting intellectual exercise, because at the end of the day, only one person can be Alexander. Again, think back to this notion of pleonexia, getting as much as you can, more than your fair share. This is, of course, Alexander, right? The king of can conquer everything. Everything belongs to you. There's only one person who can be Alexander in the whole world. But Diogenes, presumably anybody can be Diogenes. And you can be Diogenes, I can be Diogenes too. In fact, we can have a school of cynical philosophy and help each other along this path. There's a certain very interesting asymmetry. Now, more to be said about this, but I want you to see the force of this example. The force of this example, and in the words of Plutarch, the immense respect that Alexander pays to Diogenes, the acknowledgement of the strength and the force of this position, in the words of the politically the greatest man of his own day, Alexander.